The Dakota Territory blazed under an unforgiving sun, its heat rising from the endless grassland in shimmering waves that distorted the horizon. Dust devils spiraled across the prairie, carrying the bitter scent of alkali and dried sage. Near the jagged limestone outcrop called Raven Rock, a weathered log cabin stood defiantly against the vast emptiness, its mud-chinked walls scarred by hailstorms and winter blizzards that had tested its resolve for 3 hard seasons. Inside the cabin's dim interior, Arabella knelt beside the rough-hewn table where Henry struggled with his letters on a piece of slate, his small tongue poking out in concentration as he traced shaky characters with a fragment of chalk. The afternoon light filtering through small, wavy glass panes set in pine frames, windows caught the copper highlights in his hair, so achingly similar to Christopher's that her breath hitched for a moment. "Like this, Mama?" Henry asked, holding up the slate to show his crooked attempt at writing his name. Arabella smiled despite the perpetual weight in her chest, seeing Christopher's stubborn determination in their son's furrowed brow, his careful grip on the chalk. "Just like that, sweetheart. Your papa would be so proud." But even as the words left her lips, a familiar chill ran down her spine. Not from any prairie wind, but from the persistent memory of that wound on Christopher's skull. The jagged gash that the county marshal had dismissed as accidental trauma from rocks in Sweetwater Creek, but which she knew in her bones looked too precise, too deliberate, to be the work of chance. A blow delivered with purpose, not the random kiss of stone against flesh. She shivered, pulling Henry closer, her green eyes instinctively scanning the empty yard beyond their door, as if danger might materialize from her very thoughts. It was then that Satan appeared swinging down from his paint stallion with fluid, grace-moccasined feet, touching earth without disturbing so much as a pebble. 30 summers had carved his features sharp as flint, while ritual scars across his bronze chest told stories of battles fought where mercy was rarer than water in drought season. His hair was tied in 2 braids with a single eagle feather. A beaded leather shirt with fringe bore marks of deeds that would make lesser men wake, screaming from nightmares. His Winchester .73 rested easy in hands, calloused by both reins and rifle stock worn smooth by years of necessity. Across the sun-baked yard, Arabella stood frozen beside the cabin door, her knuckles bone-white around a kitchen knife that seemed pitifully inadequate against whatever evil approached through the cottonwoods. Her calico dress hung in tatters on shoulders burned copper by months of frontier hardship. Auburn hair escaped its pins to whip around a face that might once have graced eastern parlors, but now held the fierce beauty of a she-wolf defending her cubs. Behind her, weathered skirts pressed Henry, whose blue eyes reflected terror that had become their daily bread, clutching his slate against his small chest like a shield. The rifle's cracks split the morning air like Judgment Day arriving ahead of schedule. Wood exploded from the cabin door in a shower of splinters that caught sunlight like falling stars. The heavy oak planks shuddered under the bullet's impact, iron screaming as lead tore through the latch with savage precision. In the sudden silence that followed, even the constant prairie wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever violence would follow. Satan stepped forward without hesitation, his broad frame casting protective shadow over woman and child, as he positioned himself between them and death, lurking among the sun-dappled leaves. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had faced the final darkness and walked away, victorious. Inside. Now. Arabella's green eyes flickered between the stranger's granite features and the rifle smoke drifting from the grove like morning mist over a graveyard. Every instinct screamed warnings about trusting unknown men in country where survival often meant choosing between different kinds of devils. But the alternative was standing exposed, while killers took their sweet time with careful aim. She chose the devil she didn't know. The cabin door swung shut with a thud that offered more comfort to the mind than protection to the body. In the dim interior shafts of sunlight, pierced gaps between chinked logs to illuminate a sparse but tidy space that spoke of careful stewardship despite grinding poverty. A fieldstone fireplace dominated one wall, while a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs comprised their worldly furniture. Seton moved to the single window, peering through small, wavy glass panes set in pine frames that served as glass, while keeping his rifle ready for instant use. His obsidian eyes swept the terrain with methodical precision, reading the landscape like a hunter who understood that overlooked details meant death for the careless. In the cabin's close confines, Arabella caught details that danger had initially hidden. The stranger carried himself with coiled readiness, but his movements held none of the casual cruelty she'd learned to recognize in violent men. Intricate beadwork adorned his leather shirt in patterns that spoke of patience and skill, while a medicine bag hung from his belt alongside a bone-handled knife worn smooth by countless uses. "Who are you?" she whispered, not wanting her voice to carry beyond these protective walls, but needing to know if she had entrusted her son's life to another predator. "Satan," he replied, without shifting attention from the window. Oglala Lakota. The simple statement contained worlds of meaning in territory, where names carried weight and tribal affiliations could spell the difference between friendship and warfare. But something in his tone suggested this warrior fought his battles according to older codes than the casual brutality that had infected the frontier like cholera. Why help strangers? The question emerged sharper than she intended, edged with the suspicion of someone who had learned that kindness from strangers often came with hidden prices. For a heartbeat, his granite gaze met hers across the shadowed room, and she glimpsed depths of pain carefully hidden behind stoic features. When he spoke again, it was first in the musical language of his people, words that flowed like creek water over stones before he offered their translation. But the way he spoke those foreign syllables carried the weight of sacred principle, as if he were not merely explaining, but declaring something fundamental about who he was in a world that seemed to have forgotten such truths. "Mitakuye o yasin, all my relations. Your pain calls to something that remembers what honor means." Another rifle shot cracked across the morning, this bullet aimed with deliberate precision at the door's iron hardware. Metal shrieked as lead found its mark, and the heavy latch bar clattered to the packed dirt floor in a shower of sparks that danced briefly before dying. The siege had begun in deadly earnest. The Dakota Territory in summer of 1881 stretched beyond imagination like an ocean of grass and stone, where recent railroad construction had brought both dreams and nightmares in equal measure. This was country that tested every soul brave enough or desperate enough to claim it, where January winds could freeze a man solid, and August heat could drive him mad with thirst before he found water. Satan had ridden alone for better than 3 weeks, following ancient trails that connected sacred places his people had known since the world was young. The harsh winter had claimed his grandmother and 2 uncles to the spotted death, leaving him with grief that sat in his chest, like a stone that would never dissolve. He avoided white settlements except for occasional trading at Windmill Flats, where wolf pelts and elk hides could be exchanged for black powder lead shot and the refined sugar that reminded him of sweeter times. Dreams had troubled his sleep for nights, visions of a young man standing at crossroads, where one path led to honor and the other to something that made his warrior's heart sick with foreboding. The man's face remained shadowed, but something familiar in his bearing suggested blood connection that made the dreams more disturbing than simple nightmares. When smoke rose from Raven Rock's direction and Henry's terrified cry reached his ears on the wind, every warrior instinct demanded action, regardless of personal cost. Arabella's story began the previous spring when railroad surveys and territorial land grants had brought her family west with dreams of prosperity. Christopher McBride had been a surveyor whose skill with theodolite and measuring chain was matched only by his optimism about frontier opportunities. Their homestead claim encompassed 160 acres of decent grazing land, with clear water and soil that might grow crops if a man was stubborn enough. Christopher had talked endlessly of cattle and cultivation, while he traced property boundaries with meticulous precision. The cabin had been his first construction, built solid with squared logs and proper chinking to withstand whatever weather the territory might deliver. His death 2 months past had shattered more than Arabella's heart. It had destroyed the carefully planned future they'd built in conversations that lasted deep into prairie nights. The county marshal's investigation concluded Christopher had fallen near Sweetwater Creek, his skull crushed against rocks in what appeared to be tragic accident. But Arabella had examined the wound herself, had seen how the stone struck with deliberate force rather than random misfortune. She remained on the claim because the Homestead Act required 5 years' continuous residence to prove ownership, and because returning east meant consigning Henry to relatives who would see only another burden to shoulder. Better to face devils she knew than surrender to those she didn't. The men now besieging her cabin were Dirty Dan Ralston's bunch-hard cases who drifted north from Arizona territory with fresh blood on their hands and federal warrants in their saddlebags. Someone with substantial resources had hired them for work that went beyond simple theft, someone who wanted homesteaders removed from the Raven Rock district permanently. In Windmill Flats, the territorial hub that had sprouted where railroad met creek folks, whispered about silver veins threading through the Badlands, like God's own treasure map. Alphonse de Mercurio had arrived from Chicago with mining equipment and enough armed men to outfit a small army, his Italian accent carrying promises of prosperity for those wise enough to cooperate with progress. His foreman, Emmett Clark, possessed the kind of reputation that made strong men nervous and weak ones disappear entirely. The settlement itself attracted the usual mixture of dreamers and predators that frontier opportunities always spawned. Flora Whitman taught school in a converted freight shed, her Eastern education serving as lighthouse of learning in an ocean of ignorance. She'd organized local widows and bachelors into a mutual aid society that provided both practical assistance and emotional support. Dr. Theodora Pike represented something rare. As hen's teeth in frontier society, a woman physician who'd studied at a female medical college before coming west to escape civilization's suffocating prejudices. Her surgical skills and knowledge of prairie remedies made her invaluable to homesteaders who couldn't afford patent medicines. August Kolwitz worked hardscrabble farmland that barely yielded enough to service mounting debts, finding temporary solace in whiskey bottles that multiplied despite his dwindling resources. But beneath alcohol's numbing embrace lay a man who still remembered concepts like honor and obligation. Sheriff Hugh Peacemaker Lyle had arrived from Kansas with letters of recommendation that seemed almost too perfect and a past that discouraged close examination. His badge represented law and order only when such concepts served personal interests, while his gun belt rode low with practiced ease. Outside the besieged cabin, Seaton sighted carefully down his Winchester's barrel and squeezed the trigger with steady pressure. The rifle's sharp report echoed across the prairie as his bullet found its mark among the cottonwoods, sending one attacker diving for better cover, while his companions repositioned accordingly. "How many?" Arabella asked, moving to peer through a gap between logs. Seaton worked the Winchester's lever action, ejecting spent brass and chambering fresh ammunition in one fluid motion. "4, I can see for certain. Probably more staying hidden until darkness gives them advantage." The numbers struck her like physical blow. 4 seasoned killers against 1 warrior, 1 desperate woman, and a frightened child represented odds that would challenge even the most optimistic gambling man. What happens when night falls? Seaton's expression remained impassive, but she caught the flicker of concern that crossed his weathered features like cloud shadow on water. "They'll come with fire then. Try burning us out where bullets have failed to reach." As if summoned by his prophecy, A rough voice called from the grove, harsh and mocking, with the flat accent of someone who'd learned cruelty before he'd learned to read. "Hey there, lady. You got till sunset to pack your pretties and clear on out. Leave the deed and any coin you got hidden, and maybe we'll let you and the boy walk to town on your own 2 feet." Arabella's grip tightened on the kitchen knife until her knuckles showed white as sun-bleached bone against skin darkened by months of outdoor labor. The blade was sharp enough for preparing meals and defending against occasional rattlesnake, but woefully inadequate for the kind of violence these men represented. "And if we refuse?" She called back, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. The answering laughter from the cottonwoods held all the warmth of a February blizzard, promising suffering that would make death seem merciful before the final moment arrived. Night descended on the Dakota territory, like a black wool shroud bringing darkness so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. The crescent moon provided barely enough light to distinguish earth from sky, while stars glittered overhead, with cold indifference of distant campfires that offered no warmth to earthbound struggles. Seton crouched beside the cabin's single window, his Winchester cradled in arms that bore witness to battles fought in places where survival meant adapting faster than death could strike. Outside, the cottonwood grove rustled with movement that had nothing to do with the evening breeze, subtle sounds that spoke of men positioning themselves for coordinated assault. Copper filled his mouth as tension tightened every muscle in his body. The acrid scent of pitch and tar drifted on night air preparations for arson that would turn their shelter into a funeral pyre. "They're moving into position," he whispered. The first sign of attack came as flickering orange tongues against the cabin's eastern wall, where pitch-soaked rags wrapped around arrow shafts danced like demons seeking entry to their sanctuary. Acrid smoke from burning tar crept through gaps in the log chinking, followed by the ominous crackle of kindling wood beginning to catch flame. The root cellar. Arabella breathed, her voice tight with controlled terror, as she reached for Henry's trembling hand. Christopher had excavated the storage pit during their first month on the claim, digging deep into hard earth and lining walls with field stones gathered from the creek bed. Designed to preserve root vegetables through brutal winter months, it now represented their only hope of surviving the inferno that would soon consume everything above ground. Seton hauled open the heavy wooden trap door, revealing ladder rungs that descended into blackness, thick with earthy scents of stored potatoes and preserved turnips. The space below was barely large enough for 3 people to crouch without touching, but it offered protection from both flames and bullets if they could reach it before the roof collapsed. "Down, both of you. Quickly now." Arabella gathered her skirts and descended first her bare feet, finding purchase on rungs made slippery by accumulated moisture. Henry followed with careful movements of a child who understood that noise might mean death for them all. In the cellar's embrace, darkness pressed around them like something alive, with malevolent intent. Above their heads, Seton dragged a water-soaked blanket across the hatch opening before following them into the earth's protective womb. The trapdoor settled into place with a thud that seemed to echo in their bones, sealing them into what might become a literal tomb if their enemies succeeded. In absolute blackness, Arabella's world contracted to Henry's frightened breathing, and the warm presence of the warrior pressed close beside her. The acrid smell of wood smoke grew stronger as flames spread across the cabin's interior, while muffled voices indicated Dirty Dan's men were systematically destroying everything her family had built. Heat above was already making the cellar walls weep moisture that trickled down like tears from stones that had witnessed too much violence. "Mum, there's a powder fuse," Seton whispered against her ear, his breath warm on skin made sensitive by fear and proximity. "They mean to blow the door before fire can finish the job." Even as he spoke, They heard it, the distinctive hiss of burning cordage that sounded like an angry rattlesnake growing louder with each passing second. The gang had come prepared for resistance, bringing black powder charges that would reduce the cabin's heavy oak door to splinters and expose anyone hiding inside to rifle fire. "Stay with Henry." Citan breathed, his voice barely audible above increasing sounds of destruction. "Keep him quiet, no matter what happens above us." Before Arabella could protest, he was moving, lifting the hatch just enough to slip through his body, disappearing into smoke and firelight that now filled the cabin's interior. The trapdoor settled back into place, leaving her alone with her son in suffocating darkness, while sounds of systematic destruction filtered down from above. She pulled Henry close, feeling his small frame shake against her as boots stomped across burning floorboards and furniture crashed over in deliberate vandalism. Glass exploded as windows succumbed to heat, followed by the distinctive crack of splitting timber that meant the roof structure was beginning to fail. Then came the sound that stopped her heart, that terrible hissing growing ever louder as the fuse burned toward its explosive destination like fate itself, approaching on inexorable feet. Above ground, Satan belly crawled across the cabin floor through smoke thick enough to choke a strong man, his leather shirt protecting him from the worst sparks that rained down like fiery snow. Acrid fumes seared his lungs and brought tears that had nothing to do with emotion. But he pressed forward, guided by sound rather than sight. His hands found the fuse coiled near the door like a malevolent serpent, its burning tip casting dancing shadows on walls already blackened by soot and flame. The charge it led to was substantial enough to bring down half the cabin, ensuring anyone caught inside would be buried beneath tons of burning timber. His skinning knife parted the tarred rope, cleanly severing connection between flame and powder with surgical precision. The hissing stopped immediately, but relief lasted only heartbeats before rifle bullets began punching through burning walls around him like angry hornets seeking flesh. A chunk of blazing timber crashed down, pinning his left arm beneath its weight, while searing pain shot through flesh, protected only by smoke-damaged leather. He bit back an involuntary cry, using his rifle barrel as lever to free his arm, while bullets whined overhead. When he finally dove through the shattered window, he landed hard on sun-baked earth outside pain, lancing through ribs that protested the violent impact. But he was alive, and more importantly, the powder charge lay dead and harmless in the burning wreckage behind him. In the root cellar, Arabella heard gunfire cease and dared hope their protector had survived his desperate mission. When the trapdoor lifted and Citan dropped back into their underground sanctuary, she reached for him instinctively, her hands finding evidence of his ordeal in torn leather and burned flesh that radiated heat. "You're hurt?" she whispered, though darkness prevented assessment of damage's full extent. "Nothing that won't heal," he replied. But she heard the pain he was trying to conceal beneath stoic acceptance. Working by touch alone in cramped confines, she tore strips from her cotton slip, the fabric parting with sharp sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in their earthen tomb. Her fingers explored the edges of his wounds with gentle precision, mapping damage through tactile examination, while he held himself motionless under her ministrations. The burn on his forearm felt like leather left too long in sun, while the gash along his ribs was sticky with blood that seeped through torn skin. As she bound his injuries with careful efficiency, their faces remained inches apart in absolute darkness, their breathing synchronized in the intimate space they shared. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked not from fear now, but from awareness of this man who had risked everything for strangers. When she leaned closer to secure the bandages, she felt the steady rhythm of his heart beneath scarred leather that told stories of battles survived through skill and courage. "There," she whispered when her work was complete, though her hands lingered on his chest where she could feel life beating strong despite his wounds. Above them, the cabin continued its death throes as flames consumed everything her family had built during their brief time in this harsh paradise. But in the protective darkness of their refuge, something had shifted between them, recognition that transcended barriers of race and culture, born from shared danger and the absolute trust required when death stalked the night. It was Henry who made the discovery that would transform their struggle from mere survival into something resembling justice with sharp teeth. "Mama," he whispered, his small voice cutting through the charged silence between adults. "I found something hidden back here." His exploring fingers had discovered a loose stone in the cellar's wall, and behind it, wrapped in oiled leather, to protect against moisture and time, lay Christopher's surveyor's field kit. Inside the waterproof container were documents that would explain why her husband had died and why armed men now sought to drive them from land that was rightfully theirs. A hand-drawn map showing silver veins threading through bedrock beneath their homestead, like metallic lightning frozen in stone. A mineral rights claim properly filed with the territorial office and bearing official seals. And most damning of all, a deputy's badge broken and with identifying number carefully filed away, but unmistakably the star worn by a lawman who had abandoned justice for personal gain. As Citan examined the badge by flickering light that filtered through floorboards above his features, hardened with understanding that went beyond mere anger, to encompass something deeper and infinitely more dangerous. Christopher McBride hadn't died in any accident. He had been murdered by someone who wore authority's badge like a mask to hide crimes that would shock even frontier society's flexible moral standards. Dawn crept across the Dakota territory, with hesitant fingers painting the eastern sky in shades that reminded watchers of old blood and fresh copper pennies. The cabin was nothing more than smoking ruins, now its walls collapsed into charcoal and ash that still radiated heat from the night's conflagration. What had once sheltered a family's dreams now resembled a funeral pyre for ambitions that had died harder than the man who dreamed them. Citan studied the destruction with practiced eyes, noting details that might prove significant when time came for reckoning. The systematic nature of damage suggested men who had taken pleasure in their work rather than approaching it as mere business necessity. Crows circled overhead, their harsh cries adding commentary to the scene below, while morning air carried the acrid smell of burned wood, mixed with something else violence that seemed to cling to places where blood had been spilled in anger. "We can't remain here," he said simply, his voice carrying authority of experience earned through survival when lesser men had fallen. Arabella nodded while clutching Henry close, her green eyes surveying remains of everything they had owned in this world. Clothing, furniture, the few precious mementos she'd carried west from her former life, all lay buried beneath debris still too hot to touch safely. But they were alive, and Christopher's field kit with its damning evidence rested securely in Citan's medicine pouch, alongside tokens from his own people's sacred places. "Windmill Flats," she said, her voice stronger than circumstances warranted. "Flora will shelter Henry, and Dr. Pike can properly tend your wounds." The journey to town required following Sweetwater Creek through marshland, where cattails grew thick as a man's arm, and deceptive mud could swallow horse and rider without leaving trace. Under normal circumstances, such terrain would be merely challenging for experienced travelers with killers tracking their movements. It became a deadly maze, where one misstep might prove fatal. Citan led his paint stallion on foot through treacherous ground, testing each step on surfaces made unpredictable by spring runoff and recent storms. The horse's nostrils flared at the scent of bog water and rotting vegetation, but it followed with trust earned through years of partnership. Arabella and Henry rode double while scanning surrounding landscape for signs of pursuit they knew must come with morning light. The boy's weight against her was comforting, but she could feel tension in his small body that spoke of understanding beyond his years. They had covered perhaps 2 miles when hoofbeats reached them across marsh grass carried on wind that seemed to whisper warnings of approaching danger. The sound sent ice through Arabella's veins, not the random travel of honest men, but the purposeful approach of hunters who had found their trail. The ford, Seatown, indicated where creek narrowed between stands of willow and cottonwood. We cross here before they close distance. Water ran knee-deep and swift with snowmelt from distant mountains, its current strong enough to sweep away anyone who lost footing on smooth stones that littered the streambed like nature's trap for unwary. The creek's voice was a constant murmur that spoke of journeys from high places to low, carrying secrets and sorrows toward distant seas. Seaton waded in first, each step deliberate and sure, while the paint horse followed with reluctance common to creatures that understood water's treacherous nature. Current tugged at his moccasins, seeking purchase that might drag him downstream to deeper pools where men disappeared without trace. Halfway across, Henry's keen young eyes spotted movement among willows on the bank they'd abandoned. "Riders coming fast, Mama." Arabella twisted in saddle, her hand finding grip of Christopher's .36 Colt Navy, now fitted with a Richards Mason conversion for metallic cartridges, relic of his brief service during the recent unpleasantness between states. She'd practiced with the weapon every day since his death, understanding that frontier women who couldn't shoot were frontier women who didn't survive long enough to become proper widows. The first rider burst from concealment at full gallop, his mount throwing up sheets of muddy water as hooves sought purchase on treacherous creek bottom. Arabella recognized Jake Morrison from descriptions whispered in Windmill Flats, one of Dirty Dan's most trusted killers, with face like weathered saddle leather and pale blue eyes that held all the warmth of winter ice. She raised the revolver with both hands, the way Christopher had taught her, thumb drawing back hammer, while finger found trigger with practiced ease. The weapon bucked against her wrists as black powder exploded in controlled violence, and Morrison's horse screamed as her bullet found its mark in the animal's shoulder. Gunpowder smoke filled her mouth, acrid and sharp, while the echo of her shot rolled across marshland like thunder from clear sky. Horse and rider went down in thrashing confusion of legs and curses. But Morrison rolled clear of wreckage with reflexes of someone long accustomed to violent encounters. He came up with rifle already shouldered, seeking targets among willows and water, while his cold gaze promised retribution for his mount's death. The weapon's bore looked large as a cannon from Arabella's perspective, dark and hungry for flesh to feed its appetite. Satan shouldered Henry aside while bringing his Winchester to bear, but the boy's sudden weight threw off his balance on slippery stones. His moccasined feet lost grip, and he went down hard in swift-running water-wounded ribs, screaming protest as he struck rocky bottom with force that drove air from his lungs. Morrison's shot cracked across marsh, the heavy bullet splitting air, where Satan's head had been only moments before. The killer worked his rifle's lever action with smooth efficiency, chambering another round, while his pale gaze sought fresh targets among reeds and willows. Arabella was already moving, sliding from saddle into waist-deep water, while dragging Seaton behind meager protection of moss-covered boulder. In their improvised shelter, their bodies pressed together as they shared inadequate cover, her hand finding his chest to confirm reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat beneath water-soaked leather. Current tugged at her skirts, trying to pull her downstream while creek water soaked through fabric to chill skin beneath. But the cold was nothing compared to fire that burned in her chest, not fear now, but fury at men who would hunt a mother and child like wild animals. "Can you still fight?" she asked, checking his Colt for water damage with movements made sure by desperation. "Try stopping me," he replied, though she heard pain he was trying to conceal beneath determination. They moved as one, Arabella rising to fire, while Seaton rolled sideways, drawing Morrison's attention and aim in different directions, like dancers performing steps choreographed by necessity. Her second shot took the killer high in shoulder, spinning him around, but failing to drop him permanently. His return fire chipped granite from their shelter, showering them with stone fragments that drew blood from exposed skin like tiny knives. More riders were forcing their way through willows now, their harsh voices raised in excitement as they scented blood in water that would carry metallic tang downstream for miles. But they had underestimated their quarry's determination and advantages offered by Creek's rocky terrain. Satan's Colt spoke twice in rapid succession, and the heavy .45 caliber slugs finding their mark center mass in Morrison's chest. The killer pitched backward into marsh grass, with rifle spinning away to disappear beneath brown water that immediately began running red. Remaining pursuers pulled up short as they realized their easy prey had teeth sharper than anticipated and will stronger than their own hunger for violence. In brief respite that followed, Satan and Arabella reached far bank, hauling Henry and Paint Horse onto solid ground, while bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. They ran then, leaving Sweetwater Creek behind as they raced toward sanctuary of Windmill Flats, through grass that seemed to reach endlessly toward horizons offering no comfort. Behind them, Dirty Dan's voice rose in frustrated rage as he promised terrible retribution for Jake Morrison's death. But they were alive, and they carried evidence that would bring justice for Christopher's murder if they could survive long enough to present it to men who still remembered badges were meant to protect rather than exploit the innocent. Windmill Flats sprawled along railroad tracks like children's toys, scattered by careless hands, its false-fronted buildings promising everything from salvation to haircuts with equal conviction. Morning train from east had just departed, leaving behind mail passengers, and faint hope that civilization might eventually reach this outpost of organized chaos. The settlement bore scars of rapid growth, hastily constructed buildings that leaned against each other for support, boardwalks that creaked under the weight of boots, and the constant smell of sawdust and coal smoke that spoke of a community still defining itself through daily struggle. Flora Whitman met them at schoolhouse with concern etched deep in features that had weathered many frontier storms without losing essential kindness. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in practical bun, while her Eastern education showed in every carefully chosen word. "Merciful heavens, what's happened to you folks?" she exclaimed, her voice carrying musical cadence of someone who had learned to project over classroom noise. "You look like you've been through a cyclone and came out the wrong side." Arabella nearly collapsed with relief at seeing friendly face among so much hostility and violence. The sight of civilization, however rough, loosened knots of tension that had been building in her shoulders since the previous night's horrors. "They burned us out after killing Christopher," she said, her voice steady despite exhaustion that threatened to claim her. "Now they're hunting Henry and me like we were rabid dogs that need putting down." Flora's jaw tightened as she ushered them into converted freight shed that served multiple functions for community. The interior smelled of chalk dust and children's lunches, with undertone of determination that spoke of education's power to transform lives through knowledge and hope. "Dr. Pike is attending difficult birth at Henderson Place, but she left medical supplies with explicit instructions," Flora said while gathering materials from wooden crate marked with Red Cross. "Let me see to those wounds before infection sets in." As Flora cleaned and bandaged Satan's injuries with efficiency of someone who'd tended many frontier hurts, Arabella studied the man who had risked everything for strangers. His profile reminded her of carved granite, all sharp angles and uncompromising lines that spoke of life lived without softness or easy comfort. But when he looked at Henry, something gentled in those obsidian features recognition that innocence deserved protection, regardless of skin color or tribal affiliation. The boy had taken to him immediately, sensing something that adults might miss in their complications and prejudices. "Why?" she asked quietly, while Flora worked with gentle hands. "Why risk your life for people you've never met before today?" Satan remained silent for long moments, his gaze fixed on distances that existed more in memory than geography. When he finally spoke, words carried weight of old sorrows, carefully borne through seasons of loss and survival. My people understand what it means to watch homes burn while children weep for parents who will never return. He said, his voice soft as wind through prairie grass. Some wounds never heal completely, but they can teach compassion for others who suffer similar injuries. Flora stepped back to admire her handiwork, then turned attention to broken badge seton placed on rough-hewn table. Her educated eyes took in filed numbers and damaged star points with growing comprehension. Sheriff Lyle should examine this evidence, she said carefully, then leaned closer to Arabella, lowering her voice to barely above whisper. Though, I must tell you, dear, that man has been different since the mining company arrived. Questions that used to get honest answers now get silence. People who once spoke freely now glance over their shoulders. Mrs. Henderson mentioned her husband asked about mineral rights at the land office, and the next week their fence posts were mysteriously cut. Small things, you understand, but a pattern that troubles the mind. Arabella felt ice crystals forming in her stomach as Flora's words confirmed her darkest suspicions. Can we trust him to seek justice rather than his own advantage? Before Flora could respond, sound of boots on wooden walkboards announced visitors who hadn't bothered with courtesy of knocking. Schoolhouse door opened without ceremony, admitting Sheriff Hugh Peacemaker Lyle, with easy confidence of someone who considered himself ultimate authority in any space he chose to occupy. He cut impressive figure in doorway, tall and lean, with silver threading through dark hair, wearing smile that promised either salvation or damnation, depending on which side of his authority you found yourself. His gun belt rode low on narrow hips, holstered Colt worn smooth by years of regular use. "Morning, Flora," he drawled with voice like honey poured over broken glass. "Heard there was considerable excitement out at Raven Rock last night. Figured I should investigate personally." Behind Lyle came Emmett Clark, mine foreman, whose reputation for brutal efficiency had reached every corner of territory. Built like bull with massive shoulders and hands that appeared capable of crushing bone, his small pig eyes studied Seton with particular hatred. "Mrs. McBride here claims someone torched her cabin." Lyle continued his voice, carrying smooth cadence of professional politician. "That's mighty serious allegation, ma'am. Arson carries severe penalties under territorial law when properly prosecuted." Arabella felt ice form in her stomach as she recognized trap being constructed around them. The scent of bay rum and tobacco couldn't quite mask something else, corruption, that seemed to emanate from Lyle's pores. "I'm not making allegations, Sheriff," she replied, with voice steadier than circumstances warranted. "I'm stating facts that can be proven through evidence and witness testimony." Lyle's smile never wavered, though something cold flickered behind pale eyes, like winter lightning. "Facts are peculiar things, ma'am. They got way of changing depending on who's doing telling and what their motivations might be for stirring up trouble." He stepped closer, his presence filling small schoolhouse like smoke from grass fire. "Now, I've had conversations with some local men this morning. Seems there was gunplay down by Sweetwater Creek earlier. One man dead, shot full of holes." His pale eyes fixed on Arabella with predatory intensity. "Old Peterson up north of here used to ask a lot of questions too about land rights and such. His spread's real quiet now, real peaceful like. Sometimes questions lead to answers folks ain't prepared to live with." The threat hung in air like noose, waiting for next to fill it, cooperate with his version of events, or face charges for defending their own lives against armed assault. Flora stepped forward with spine straight, as Ramrod, her Eastern education lending authority to words spoken in defense of innocence. "Sheriff, these people were attacked without provocation by armed men. They have evidence suggesting..." Evidence, Lyle's laugh held no trace of genuine humor. You mean this trinket here? He gestured toward broken badge without making any move to examine it closely, omission that spoke volumes to anyone with eyes sharp enough to notice. Emmett Clark shifted his considerable weight, thick fingers resting casually on gun butt in gesture that managed to appear unconscious while deliberately threatening. Heard tell there might be some papers involved too. Survey maps and such like. Wouldn't want important documents falling into inappropriate hands, where they might get misinterpreted by folks who don't understand the complexities of territorial development. Menace was impossible to ignore, now filling Schoolhouse with tension thick enough to cut with a knife. These men weren't seeking justice or truth, they were conducting damage control while positioning themselves to commit additional crimes. Citan rose slowly from his chair movement, drawing both men's attention like iron filings toward Magnet. His hand remained well clear of weapons, but every line of his body radiated coiled violence that predators recognized instinctively. We leave now, he said with quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed when circumstances demanded action. Lyle's smile widened to show teeth white as fresh snow against weathered features, but his eyes remained cold as January wind. Well, now I reckon that's your prerogative, friend. But you should understand, if I hear any more wild stories about murder and conspiracy, I might find myself obliged to take official action. And official action in my jurisdiction tends to be both swift and permanent. He touched brim of his hat in mock courtesy while his pale gaze promised retribution. Y'all have yourselves blessed day, you hear. After corrupt lawmen departed, Schoolhouse felt smaller somehow, as if walls had drawn closer to contain fear they'd left behind. Flora's face was pale but determined as she helped gather their few remaining possessions. There's freight wagon heading for mining district this afternoon, she said in carefully lowered tones. August Kolwitz drives supply runs to Raven Rock on regular basis. He's got problems with Bottle, but he's fundamentally honest where it matters most. The freight wagon rolled through afternoon heat that rose from prairie in visible waves, its iron-shod wheels throwing up clouds of alkali dust that hung in still air like smoke from distant battles. August Kolwitz hunched over leather reins with permanent squint of someone who'd stared too long into horizons that promised everything and delivered disappointment. Sweat ran in rivers down his weathered face, carrying sour smell of fear mixed with whiskey that had become his constant companion. But his hands remained steady on traces, while bloodshot eyes scanned terrain ahead with wariness born of experience. Hidden beneath canvas tarps, among crates of blasting powder and mining equipment, 3 fugitives tried making themselves invisible while their wagon creaked toward uncertain sanctuary. The air was stifling under heavy fabric, thick with smell of dynamite and metal that spoke of violent intentions. Seton studied Christopher's survey map with intensity of hunter reading tracks, noting careful notations that marked mineral deposits with scientific precision. The dead surveyor's work revealed silver veins threading through bedrock like metallic lightning frozen in stone ore that would generate fortunes for whoever controlled legal claims. When his eyes met Arabella's in close confines of their hiding place, something electric passed between them that had nothing to do with the dangerous circumstances surrounding them. Her hand found his in darkness, fingers intertwining with natural ease that spoke of trust earned through shared hardship. Here, he said quietly, indicating section marked with Christopher's initials while their joined hands rested on the map. Richest deposit runs directly beneath your homestead. Arabella's features hardened as understanding crystallized into cold fury. So they murdered him for mapping wealth on land they couldn't legally steal through normal channels. Henry pressed close to his mother's side, his young mind struggling to comprehend adult world of greed and murder that had destroyed their peaceful existence. But intelligence sparkled in eyes that seemed older than his 6 years' quick understanding that might serve him well in battles ahead. The wagon lurched suddenly as August hauled back on reins, bringing his team to stamping halt that sent dust swirling around them. Through gaps in canvas covering, they could observe riders approaching from Eastern Ridge, 4 men on lathered horses, whose grim expressions suggested trouble. "Emmett Clark," August muttered, expelling stream of tobacco juice over wagon's side, while his voice carried undertone of fear. "Should have known that snake would turn up eventually." Mine foreman rode alongside wagon with casual arrogance, born from years of having orders followed without question. His pig-like eyes swept over visible cargo before settling on August's guilty expression with patience of cat that had cornered prey. "Afternoon, August." Clark rumbled with voice like grinding millstones. "Hope you don't mind if we take a look at what you're hauling today. Just routine inspection, you understand." August's Adam's apple bobbed convulsively as he struggled, finding words that might deflect suspicion without triggering violence. "Just routine supplies for mining operation, Mr. Clark. Nothing unusual or noteworthy about this load." Emmett's smile possessed all warmth of January wind across frozen ground. "Funny thing, though. I heard rumors you might be carrying passengers today. Folks I got pressing business with." Beneath their canvas concealment, Seaton's hand found grip of his Colt, while Arabella clutched Henry against her side free hand, seeking reassurance of Christopher's Navy revolver, its Richards Mason conversion shining dully. The dynamite crates surrounding them seemed to pulse with potential destruction. One stray bullet could transform their hiding place into crater. In close quarters, every breath seemed unnaturally loud, every heartbeat a thunder that surely their enemies must hear. But when Arabella's fingers tightened on his Seaton, felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for longer than he cared to remember. "Search the wagon," Emmett ordered with authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. One of his subordinates dismounted and approached tailgate with rifle ready. Sound of his boots on hardpan seemed unnaturally loud in prairie silence that stretched between hunter and hunted. Then August's voice cut through tension with determination, powered by liquid courage and genuine remorse. "Hold on there, Emmett. This here's my wagon, and I got legal rights regarding its contents under territorial statute." Foreman's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering. "You got rights to bullet in brain if you keep flapping your jaw, old man." But August had discovered backbone at bottom of his whiskey bottle, and Dutch courage was making him stubborn. "Maybe so, but this load's carrying black powder that gets mighty unstable in summer heat. That rifle throws sparks, and sparks got way of causing unfortunate accidents." The threat was real enough to give even Emmett pause. Dynamite could indeed be triggered by smallest flame, and resulting explosion would send everyone present to meet their maker in spectacular display. After tense moment that seemed to stretch like taffy, Emmett waved his man back from wagon. "Spread out and search surrounding area instead. If they're hiding hereabouts, we'll flush them out." Riders dispersed to quarter ground around stationary wagon, their horses snorting and stamping, as prairie dogs chattered warnings from burrows. Time crawled past like injured animal while searchers worked their way outward in expanding circles. In their hiding place, Arabella became acutely aware of Sitan's proximity warmth of his body, scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to his skin, steady rhythm of breathing that somehow calmed her racing heart. When his thumb traced across her knuckles in silent reassurance, she felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with stifling canvas cover. Finally, Emmett's voice carried across distance as frustration overcame patience. "Nothing here? They must have taken different route entirely." Sound of retreating hoofbeats gradually faded as riders moved toward south. August waited until they were mere specks on horizon before climbing down from driver's seat, his legs shaking with reaction. "They're gone for now?" he called softly to hidden passengers. Setan emerged from beneath canvas, first his rifle ready as he scanned empty landscape for signs of deception. Only when satisfied they were truly alone did he help Arabella and Henry down from cramped concealment. As she stepped to ground, her hand lingered in his for a moment longer than necessity required, and he caught scent of lavender soap mixed with sweat and determination that made something tighten in his chest. "Why risk your neck for us?" Arabella asked August directly, her green eyes searching weathered face for truth beneath guilt. Farmer's cheeks flushed red above grizzled beard as shame and whiskey combined to loosen tongue. "I ain't proud of things I done in past for money. Took Emmett's coin to identify which homesteads were isolated, which families might be easy targets." The admission hung in air like accusation seeking judgment. August's information had helped paint targets on families who trusted in law and justice. Christopher was one of names I gave them. He continued meeting Arabella's gaze with difficulty. "His blood's on my hands, same as if I'd swung club myself." Rage rose in Arabella's throat, hot and bitter with betrayal, compounded by loss. This man's greed had marked her husband for murder and left her son fatherless. But Henry tugged at her sleeve with innocent wisdom. "Mama, he's trying to help us now. Doesn't that count for something?" From mouths of babes came forgiveness that put adult grudges to shame. August was seeking redemption the only way available, by risking life to balance scales that might never be even, but could perhaps be less weighted toward injustice. 5 miles ahead lay the mining camp sprawled across badlands, like festering wound in earth's flesh. At August's line shack, crude shelter built from scrap lumber and tar paper, they waited while he scouted the main operation. But when he returned near midnight, his expression carried grim intelligence. "They got main camp locked down tighter than miser's purse." He reported producing leather-bound ledger from inside coat. "But I managed to get close enough to office building when Emmett was drunk and careless with his keys." Setan examined damning entries by lamplight, his features growing cold as obsidian as he read evidence of systematic corruption. Payments to Sheriff Lyle for security services, bribes to territorial officials, and most devastating of all, specific entry: surveyor C removal, $30 split 4 ways. The date matched Christopher's death exactly, but it was signature at bottom of page that stopped Seaton's heart like bullet through chest. Written in flowing script he knew as well as his own name: Kota Wikayawa, Deputy U.S. Marshal Scout, Dakota Territory. The revelation hit him like physical blow that stole breath and left him staring at page in disbelief. Kota, his younger brother, taken during reservation raid 2 years previous, had not only survived captivity, but had been corrupted into participating in very crimes they now sought to expose. Pain cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. Kota had been barely 21 when soldiers came young and idealistic enough to believe cooperation might save their people from further violence. To discover he had been twisted into instrument of oppression was almost more than Setan's warrior heart could bear. "You recognize that name?" Arabella asked, reading devastation in his expression. Setan nodded slowly, each movement requiring effort, as if his head had suddenly become too heavy. "My brother. They claimed he would serve as guide for territorial mapping expeditions. But this..." He gestured at Ledger with fingers that trembled despite all efforts at control. "This proves they made him accomplice to murder." Outside line shack night, sounds carried on prairie wind, distant howl of coyotes, rustle of grass. And something else that made Setan's warrior instincts prickle with alarm. Hoofbeats approaching at speed from multiple directions. "They found us," he said with calm acceptance. August cursed while reaching for old Springfield rifle, but speed was no longer option for escape. Riders had already surrounded shelter, cutting off retreat, while harsh voices rose in triumph. "Come out with hands visible." Dirty Dan's voice carried through thin walls. "Do it peaceful-like, and maybe we'll make deaths quick." Inside Shack, they faced impossible choices. But Satan had not survived 30 winters by accepting defeat. "Back wall," he said, studying crude construction. "These boards are loose enough to move." Working with desperate efficiency, they pried away planking, creating opening barely wide enough for adult bodies. Henry went first, his small size, allowing him to slip out silently. Arabella followed with skirts catching on rough wood, determination overcoming physical obstacles. As she squeezed through gap, Satan's hand steadied her with touch that sent warmth through her despite circumstances. Their eyes met for heartbeat in darkness, and something passed between them that needed no words. Satan came last, pausing only to grab crate of dynamite from August's supplies. If they were going to flee, they might as well leave pursuers' memorable farewell gift. The explosion that followed turned night into temporary day, as Line Shack disintegrated in ball of flame and flying debris. In chaos that followed, 3 figures slipped away into darkness along game trails that only ancient wisdom could follow. Behind them, curses filled prairie night as frustrated hunters realized cunning and desperation had once again cheated them of victory. 3 days later found them in natural cave, carved from Badlands red stone, while storm clouds gathered overhead like army of the damned. Lightning flickered in their depths like artillery fire from heaven's cannons, while thunder rolled across Badlands with voice of divine judgment. In Windmill Flats, word had reached them through Flora's network of concerned citizens. Tommy Morrison, 6-year-old son of widow Jenny Morrison, had disappeared along with his mother. Their homestead showed signs of struggle, overturned furniture blood on kitchen floor. "They're using him as bait." Arabella set her voice tight with controlled fury. "Taking innocent children to draw us out." The note arrived that afternoon, delivered by nervous cowboy. "If you want to see the Morrison boy alive, bring the woman and the half-breed to Lost Horse Bridge at sunset. Come alone, come armed, maybe we can work something out. H. Lyle, Sheriff, Dakota Territory." Lost Horse Bridge was rickety wooden structure spanning Sweetwater Creek, at its narrowest point perfect place for ambush. But they had no choice. They couldn't abandon a child to killers, regardless of personal cost. As they approached bridge in gathering dusk, they could see small figure tied to central support. Tommy Morrison, his young face streaked with tears, but posture defiant. Beside him stood Sheriff Lyle, his badge catching last rays of sunlight. "That's far enough," Lyle called when they reached eastern approach. "Just the woman and the breed. Everyone else stays back." They walked onto bridge together, footsteps echoing hollowly on weathered planks. Below them, Sweetwater Creek gurgled over rocks polished smooth by countless seasons. At bridge's center, Lyle waited with rifle ready. His wounded arm was bound in crude bandages, and his eyes held wild desperation of man whose empire was crumbling. "Now that's more like it," he said with voice that had lost its earlier smoothness. "Though I got to say I'm disappointed. Thought maybe you'd learned some sense by now." But it was Tommy Morrison who provided distraction, and they needed his young voice cutting through adult tension. "My mama says you're a bad man, Sheriff Lyle." The unexpected defiance caught Lyle off guard, for instant opening Seton had been waiting for. He grabbed Arabella and pulled her toward Bridge's railing just as rifle fire erupted from both sides of creek. Someone had brought kerosene lantern too close to Bridge's tar-soaked timbers, and flames began licking at eastern approach. The wooden structure was becoming death trap as fire spread with horrifying speed. In chaos that followed, they managed to cut Tommy free and leap into creek's cold waters, the burning bridge collapsing behind them in shower of sparks and flaming debris. Storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally opened their fury upon Dakota territory. At Raven Rock mining compound, muddy water was beginning to pool as runoff sought path of least resistance into tunnels carved below natural drainage level. Sheriff Lyle paced main office like caged wolf, his wounded pride demanding satisfaction. Emmett Clark lounged against wall with patience of man, accustomed to violence, while in mine's depths, Kota Wikayawa stood guard over crates of black powder. The young deputy's uniform bore insignia of territorial authority, but inside his chest, emotions warred like competing storms. Confrontation at Gully had awakened memories he'd tried burying, summer hunts in Sacred Hills, lessons about honor and courage that had seemed irrelevant in a world that rewarded only survival. Standing alone in tunnel that reeked of blasting powder and fear sweat, Kota remembered his grandfather's weathered hands, teaching him to read tracks in mud beside the sacred creek. "Takoja," the old man had said, "a warrior's heart knows right from wrong, even when his mind is clouded by desperate choices." The twisted sage bundle he dropped as warning to his brother had been impulse born of a weakness, moment when old loyalties had overwhelmed carefully constructed defenses. But seeing Satan again had reminded him of who he used to be, before hunger and desperation had driven him to accept bargains that poisoned his soul, one compromise at a time. Now, as water pooled around his feet and thunder echoed through stone passages, Kota wondered if redemption was still possible for someone who had sold his honor in installments too small to notice until the final payment came due. The assault began at midnight, with Dr. Theodora Pike creating distraction at main entrance. Dynamite explosion collapsed part of tunnel, while sending geyser of muddy water skyward in spectacular display. Men poured out of office building immediately, their voices lost in thunder's roar as they rushed toward apparent attack. But Lyle possessed too much experience to fall for misdirection. He remained at post, with rifle-ready pale eyes scanning darkness. Satan was already moving his body, flowing across open ground with fluid grace. Office building's rear door was unlocked carelessness that would prove fatal. Inside, oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls lined with mining equipment and territorial maps. The air reeked of tobacco smoke and fear sweat, while Lyle's voice carried from front room as he barked orders to men no longer present. Seaton found replacement ledger on Lyle's desk, hastily compiled substitute containing not just records of past crimes, but detailed plans for expanding operations throughout territory. At document's bottom, two signatures caught his attention. Lyle's familiar scrawl, and below it, Kota Wikayawa, Deputy U.S. Marshal, Dakota Territory. His brother had been promoted to positions of authority that made him equal partner in conspiracy's crimes. Disappointed brother. Kota's voice came from doorway, soft and sad and devoid of surprise. Young deputy stood silhouetted against stormlight uniform, soaked through but gun hand steady. Satan turned slowly, damning ledger clutched in trembling hands. "I had hoped for better, from blood of my blood. Hope is luxury I learned to abandon." Kota replied, stepping into lamplight. "They taught me that lesson during 6 months in their jail, eating scraps while listening to them plan which of our cousins to eliminate next." Pain in his voice carried authentic suffering, but it failed to excuse what he had become. Seton studied his brother's face, searching for traces of idealistic young man who had once believed cooperation might save their people. "So, you joined them, rather than dying with dignity." Kota's laugh held bitterness sharp enough to cut flesh. "Dignity doesn't prevent children from starving. Honor doesn't stop soldiers from burning villages. Pride is what dead martyrs use to comfort themselves in graves." Behind Kota, Sheriff Lyle appeared in doorway with rifle raised. Blood seeped through bandages around wounded shoulder while his eyes held wild desperation. "Enough philosophy," he snarled. "Kill him and finish this." But instead of reaching for his weapon, Coda continued staring at his brother, with expression that might have been regret or longing. "Do you remember?" he asked quietly in their native tongue. "What our grandfather taught us about true warrior's path?" Sitan felt something shift in chest flicker of hope, that perhaps redemption remained possible. "Akichita wan oyate kin niwi chakia iche, a warrior always protects the people. Even when protection costs him everything. Han, hechetuelo, yes, that is way it must be." But before Coda could make his choice, young Henry's voice cut through tension from behind them. "Don't hurt Sitas, he's my friend." The boy had somehow followed them into building, his small figure appearing in doorway with innocent courage that made everyone freeze. In that moment of distraction, Emmett Clark emerged from shadows with massive hands reaching for Henry's throat. "Well, well," Clark rumbled with voice like grinding stone. "Looks like we got ourselves proper leverage now." He lifted Henry by shirt collar, boy's feet dangling helplessly, while thick fingers tightened around small throat. "Drop your weapons, or I snap this little neck like twig." Water was pouring into main shaft now with increasing volume, turning underground passages into death traps. Outside, remaining guards were in full retreat as Storm continued its relentless assault. Time seemed suspended as three men faced ultimate choice: personal survival or protection of innocent life. In that crystalline moment, Coda finally remembered who he had been before corruption poisoned his soul. When his hand moved, it was faster than conscious thought, not toward his own weapon, but toward Lyle's rifle barrel, deflecting it, just as Sheriff's finger tightened on trigger. The shot went wide, punching through window glass and sending shards cascading. In same instant, Sitan drew his Colt and placed 2 bullets center mass in Emmett Clark's chest. The mine foreman's grip loosened as he toppled backward, releasing Henry, who ran immediately to Arabella's arms as she appeared in doorway, her own weapon smoking from the shot that had finished Clark permanently. Sheriff Lyle lay dying on wooden floor, his blood pooling around broken badge that would never again pervert justice. Outside, Storm was washing away most evidence, but some would survive. Ledger in Sitan's hands contained information sufficient to expose corruption reaching highest levels of territorial government. "It's finished," Coda said, his voice barely audible above wind and rain. Sitan looked at his brother, truly looked at him for first time since their reunion. Young man's features bore lines that hadn't existed 2 years earlier, while his eyes held depths of suffering that spoke of terrible compromises. But beneath damage, something essential remained, something that had remembered warrior's code when ultimate choice had to be made. "Not yet," Sitan replied, helping his brother stand. "But soon." Dawn approached Dakota territory with reluctant fingers that painted storm-washed badlands in shades of gold and crimson. At Raven Rock mining compound, muddy water continued flowing from collapsed entrance, creating temporary lake where solid ground had existed hours before. Marshal Isaiah Garrett arrived with column of federal deputies, his gray eyes taking in scene of destruction, while Sitan handed him salvaged ledger. The marshal's experienced gaze scanned damning entries with jaw tightening at each revelation. "This will cause considerable disruption in territorial capital," he said finally. "Some of these names belong to men I've known for years." Over several hours, they provided detailed testimony covering not just recent events, but pattern of harassment and violence that had plagued district for months. Coda's account proved particularly valuable, offering insider perspective on conspiracy's operations. When formal interviews concluded, Garrett drew Sitan aside. "Territorial governor will want to offer you official position, deputy marshal, perhaps even sheriff of this district. You've got necessary skills, and local folks trust you." Sitan considered offer with seriousness it deserved. Badge would provide power to protect people like Arabella and Henry from future predators. But it would also tie him to institutions and procedures that might constrain his ability to act when action was needed most. I'll consider it carefully, he said finally. As they prepared for journey back to Windmill Flats, Arabella found herself walking beside Satan, their conversation turning to practical matters that had been impossible to consider during crisis. "Homestead claim remains valid," she said. "Christopher's death doesn't invalidate our right to land." Satan nodded, understanding significance beyond legal technicalities. Claim represented foundation upon which she could build new life for herself and Henry. "What will you do with it?" he asked. Arabella was quiet for moments, her gaze fixed on horizons where heat shimmers danced above prairie grass. Christopher always dreamed of running cattle, said this country was meant for grazing rather than farming. "You'd need experienced partners," Satan observed carefully. "People with knowledge and resources." She looked at him, then her green eyes holding question she didn't quite dare voice. Partnership forged in fire and blood had proven stronger than either had expected, but translating battlefield alliance into something more domestic required different kind of courage. When her hand found his, as they walked, fingers intertwining with natural ease, he felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for longer than he cared to remember. "I might," she said with careful precision that didn't hide hope in her voice. "If I could find right kind of partners." 2 weeks after storm that ended Sheriff Lyle's reign of terror, Windmill Flats bustled with activity as preparations began for most remarkable wedding Dakota territory had witnessed in years. What made it extraordinary was not simply bride frontier widows remarrying for practical reasons was common enough, but union between two people from different worlds brought together by circumstances that had tested their courage and proven their character. Territorial Courthouse in Rock Creek had been busy with trials and testimony as corruption was systematically dismantled. Judge Isidore Bell presided over proceedings that would reshape political landscape for generations. Evidence from Lyle's ledger, combined with Coda's detailed testimony, had resulted in indictments reaching territorial capital. Alphonse de Mercurio faced charges that would likely see him hanged. Corrupt officials found their careers in ruins, replaced by men who understood that frontier justice meant protecting innocent rather than exploiting vulnerable. Most importantly, court ordered full restitution for families driven from claims or suffering losses due to conspiracies' predations. Seized assets would provide compensation that couldn't restore lost lives, but might help living rebuild shattered dreams. Arabella's homestead claim was not only confirmed, but expanded, court awarding her mineral rights to silver veins Christopher had discovered. She would never be wealthy by Eastern standards, but would never again face desperate poverty that made frontier widows vulnerable to predators. Coda had surprised everyone by refusing immunity offer in exchange for testimony. Instead, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and accepted sentence of 5 years supervised service under Seaton's guardianship punishment, acknowledging both crimes and ultimate choice to do right when it mattered most. Dr. Theodora Pike established proper medical clinic in Windmill Flats, while Flora Whitman officially adopted Tommy Morrison, giving orphaned boy home where his intelligence could flourish. And on crisp autumn morning, when cottonwood leaves drifted down like golden snow, Satan and Arabella stood before Judge Bell to speak vows earned through fire and blood, tested by violence and proven stronger than death itself. Ceremony was simple, but profound. Arabella wore her one good dress, carefully mended where bullets had torn fabric. Satan had set aside his ceremonial war bonnet for plain black hat, though he retained traditional beadwork and medicine bag containing tokens from their shared struggle. "Do you, Satan of Oglala, Lakota, take this woman to be your wife, to protect and provide for her and her child, according to laws of Dakota territory and customs of your people?" Seaton's voice was steady as he spoke words practiced in both English and Lakota. "I do," I pledge my shield to her protection, my strength to her service, my life to her defense. As eagle mates for life, so do I choose her above all others. Do you, Arabella McBride, take this man to be your husband, to stand beside him through whatever trials may come? Arabella's eyes never left Seaton's face as she spoke vows coming from depths of experience rather than romantic fantasy. I do. I choose him not from desperation or convenience, but from knowledge that he is man of honor who will never break faith with those he loves. As he has protected me, so will I stand by him. Rings forged from silver, taken from Christopher's surveyor tools, fitting symbol of how new love could grow from ashes of old grief without dishonoring what came before. Henry stood beside them, his young face solemn with understanding that he was joining family bound by choice rather than mere circumstance. When Judge Bell pronounced them husband and wife, Seaton's kiss was gentle but thorough, sealing promises tested by violence and proven stronger than fear. Small audience erupted in applause that echoed through courthouse like thunder, announcing better weather ahead. As newlyweds stepped onto courthouse porch, they found Coda waiting with 3 horses, saddled and ready. "Where are we going?" Henry asked, eyes bright with excitement. Seaton smiled, lifting Boy onto his shoulders. "Home. To build ranch your mother and I planned during those long nights when we talked about what we would do if we survived. Ride back to Raven Rock took them through country transformed by recent events. Where once there had been fear and suspicion, now there was cooperation as neighbors worked together to rebuild what violence had destroyed. At Homestead, they found workers busy with construction projects funded by Arabella's restitution settlement. New house rising from old cabin's ashes was larger and better built with proper windows and stone foundation that would stand against anything short of another war. More important than physical improvements was sense of security that allowed them to plan for future rather than merely surviving each day. Seaton had purchased breeding stock from Wyoming rancher Hereford cattle that would thrive on tough prairie grass while providing steady income. "It won't be easy," Arabella said as they watched sunset paint their expanding domain in gold and crimson. Building ranch, raising cattle, dealing with neighbors who still think we're unusual match. Seaton's arm tightened around her waist, his scarred hands gentle as they rested on slight swell of her belly where their first child grew. "Nothing worthwhile ever is easy, but we've faced worse odds and emerged victorious." It was true beyond dispute. They had confronted corruption backed by wealth, and official authority survived ambushes and explosions and violence that broke weaker souls. Building ranch and raising family would present challenges, but they were challenges that could be faced together with confidence born of tested partnership. Henry had adapted to new circumstances with childhood's resilience, quickly accepting Seaton as father he'd lost too young to remember. Boy showed promise as horseman and natural curiosity about cattle business that suggested he might one day inherit more than just land from his parents' sacrifice. Coda proved invaluable as both ranch hand and bridge between white and Lakota communities, his knowledge of both cultures helping to ease tensions that might otherwise have made their mixed-race family's life more difficult. His redemption was slow and sometimes painful but genuine, measured not in words but in daily actions, proving his commitment to earning back what he'd lost. As winter approached and first snows began dusting Badlands with white that would soon cover everything in pristine beauty, Seaton found himself standing on porch of their new home, watching his wife teach their son to read by lamplight, while Coda whittled toys for baby who would arrive with spring's return. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that would have seemed impossible during desperate days when survival was measured in hours rather than years, when each dawn brought fresh dangers that tested their resolve. On the mantelpiece above their fireplace, Christopher's broken deputy badge rested beside his survey map and a small twist of sage tied with sinew. not the warning bundle Coda had dropped during their darkest hour, but a blessing bundle representing hope restored and family bonds stronger than blood or betrayal. Outside their windows, Tommy Morrison's laughter rang across the yard as he and Henry played with wooden horses. Coda had carved their innocent joy, a testament to resilience of human spirit when nurtured by love and protected by courage. But real victory was not preserved in symbols or monuments. It lived in laughter of children who could play without fear, in determination of homesteaders who knew their rights would be protected, in daily choices of ordinary people who had learned that courage was not absence of fear, but decision to act despite it. On quiet evenings, when wind carried scent of snow from distant mountains, Satan would sometimes find his hand moving to medicine bag, where he kept twist of sage blessed by tribal elders before his journey west. The sacred bundle no longer whispered warnings of danger, but instead carried prayers of gratitude for family found in most unlikely circumstances. Warrior's vigil would never truly end. There would always be predators seeking to exploit weakness, corruption, finding new faces and methods, violence requiring response from those who value justice over safety. But for now, in this moment, blessed by peace earned through sacrifice, love had proven stronger than hatred, and honor had triumphed over greed. In growing darkness of prairie night, 3 generations of chosen families settled into home, built from determination and defended by courage, tested in fires that would have consumed lesser spirits. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all tomorrows did on frontier where survival was never guaranteed and comfort was luxury few could afford. But they would face whatever came together, bound by vows forged in violence and tempered by trials that had proven their worth beyond doubt. Foundation was solid, future was possible, and love tested by fire and proven true would light their way through whatever darkness might threaten the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Outside, coyotes called across vast emptiness that no longer seemed threatening, but simply part of natural order that included both beauty and danger in measures that kept life interesting without making it unbearable. In their bed that night, Arabella's head rested on Satan's shoulder, while Henry slept peacefully in an adjoining room, and Coda stood watch with rifle that would never again serve corruption's purposes. "I love you," she whispered against his chest, words carrying weight of experience rather than empty sentiment. "Kantitsi hila," he replied in Lakota, then translated, "My heart in all languages and in all ways that matter most." The promise of forever was sweet on their lips as they kissed in darkness that held no fear. Only promise of mornings yet to come, and family yet to grow beneath Dakota's sky that had witnessed their struggles, and now blessed their union with stars that would shine long after their own lights had joined ancestors in eternal dance of love and honor.